Hey guys, and welcome back to another Lost Bits video here on TetraBitGaming, the series where we explore the unused, altered, and unseen content in gaming. The support on the last two Pizza Tower videos has been crazy, so we are back again, and this time we'll be checking out various unused objects as well as unused areas that are left over in the final release of the game. Anyways, we got a whole ton of interesting stuff to go through, so go deliver some pizza to that like button below. It's time to find some more Pizza Tower Lost Bits. Alright, so first, let's kick things off by having a look at some unused objects that are left over in the game. Now, I mentioned the tombstone for the old version of the ghost transformation in my last video, but it's actually still left over in the files of the final cut of the game. For those that didn't see the previous video, basically, instead of needing to find a priest guy to return to normal, in older pre-release builds, the player would have to reach a tombstone, and this stone variant is one that could be picked up and thrown around to get through certain areas. Then next up, there are several blocks that could have only been destroyed with certain transformations left over unused here too. For example, there's this one which would have obviously required the barrel to bust through, and then we got this one which would have required the ball transformation, one for the cheese ball, as well as a G block requiring Gustavo and Brick to bust through. Other unused leftover blocks include two alternate designs for ice blocks, one for a scrapped thermometer mechanic in the freezer level, and these ones that would have had you slide in the night transformation. There's a secret destroyable block, which was a version of the big breakable blocks that would be exclusively seen in secret rooms in the game, and we'll get to them later in this video, but these are also seen in some unused secret rooms that are left over in the game too. There's a glass block object that would have protected the treasure seen in the game, there's this bouncy tomato block that would bounce a player upwards, and there's also an unused enemy block featuring some artwork of the cheese slime enemy. Now, these were seen in pre-release versions of Pizza Tower and would require the player to throw an enemy at them in order to break them. And lastly, there's a very basic unused sprite of a Mach 4 block, which, as suggested by the name, would require the player to be traveling at least at Mach 4 speed in order to break it. Then next up, we have this unused object listed as Golden Door, and it is indeed a door that is golden, go figure. And there's actually a duplicate of this door listed as Snick Challenge, which was something seen in the Sage 2019 demo of this game. Anyways, this door is actually a remnant from early demo builds of the game, where it was seen when getting to the end of a level or at the end of Snick's challenge. The next unused object is Noise Bomb Spawner, and this is a leftover from earlier demos where the noise would peep into a level through a window and, as the name implies, would throw down a bomb towards Peppino. This object can also still be loaded into the game, and surprisingly still works flawlessly as it was intended. Interestingly, it should also be noted that this object uses an old design for the noise where his hat would have appeared more so like a pizza, and he also had a pizza logo on his chest. And there's actually another pair of unused objects related to the noise, Noise Trap Rock and Noise Rock. And essentially, these would have had the noise pushing down a rock at Peppino in order to bamboozle him. I kind of like the idea of the noise randomly doing stuff like this in a level in order to mess you up. Then next up is this phone on a pedestal known as Phone Booth, and no, this isn't the same phone booth that is seen in the hub world. Now, a different variant of this was actually seen in a few demo builds as part of the title screen where Peppino would answer it to start the game. However, when loading this phone booth object remnant into the current release of the game, Peppino actually has a different animation where he will start screaming after he picks up the phone. Doing this will also start a timer that pops up on the screen and counts down faster than normal. Oh yeah, and you also can't move at all in this state, so the game basically soft locks, at least until the timer runs out. Anyways, the next unused object is a red balloon, and as balloons tend to do in video games, these would cause the player to bounce upwards when touching them. There's this large pile of corn that, as we went over in my previous video, used to be the way that Mort would leave the player instead of finding a priest. And you are now required by law to say hi to Mort in the comments. Another rather interesting leftover object that goes unused is the giant pizza. In earlier builds of Pizza Tower, collecting these would reward the player with a whopping 1,000 points, and these were typically seen as the main prize for finding a secret room. Then we have this very early looking object known simply as Cheese Boat, and this large boat of cheese was supposed to be used in an older version of the hub area and would help you reach certain areas that would be normally inaccessible without it. Next, there's a whole ton of unused enemy object data that also remains left over in Pizza Tower 2. Most of these are early versions of enemies either seen in the game, were seen in earlier pre-release builds, or are only seen in some of the secret rooms found in the hub world that often show early or unused designs. But for the most part, yeah, these aren't seen in the game as they were intended. First, I mentioned this fella in my previous video as part of the scrapped pizza car transformation, but apparently this fella's name is Phil, and really he just looks like he's a guy trying to get to his day job. Next up, there's a purple trash can that, similarly to older versions of the trash can enemies, would shoot out balls of cheese which could be used to transform into the cheese ball transformation. In the final game, the idea of using any trash cans for the cheese balls was scrapped, and instead only the giant cheese slimes have the ability to turn Peppino into a cheese ball. Then other unused enemy objects include a police car weenie that would have appeared in the city level and would have chased you around and could only be defeated with a parry. Apparently, if it did end up catching you, it would have brought you to a prison cell. Then there's an early version of the grabby hands that also have an unused functionality where they would give a thumbs up to you if you would give it a high five with Peppino's slap attack that was cut earlier on in development. There's an early version of the Clownmado enemy that would bounce you up and couldn't be defeated, a cheese Peppino robot that would have been a yellow variant that had the ability to shoot out cheese balls to turn Peppino into the sticky cheese transformation. A dummy test enemy that, despite looking like a cheese slime, functions differently and can only be defeated by mashing the dash button. A scrapped meatball boulder enemy that was seen in earlier versions of Oregano Desert and actually couldn't harm the player and was used to destroy blocks and other objects. There's Mr. Car, who, although makes an appearance in the game in Pig City and the graffiti area, was supposed to be an enemy that would require the player to be running at least at Mach 3, and after being defeated, he would have exploded. There's a leftover early version of the trash pan enemies who, like we went over earlier, would have launched cheese balls instead of giving Peppino the ability to ride its lid. There's leftover data for a little Pepperman bomb that was seen in the Pepperman boss fight in an old demo of the game from 2018. And similarly, the noise bomb is also left over, and this was seen in a fight against the noise that never made it to the final cut of the game, and here the noise bomb would follow you around much like a Toppin. Then next, there's an early version of the cardboard tank enemy that originally, instead of just standing in place, it would have actually used its wheels and would charge towards Peppino, and in addition to spawning cheese slimes, it could only have been defeated by throwing another enemy at it, and after defeat, it would drop some pizza slices for the player. Then also, as we discussed in my previous video, here we got the Camembert Squire enemy that once, after defeating it, was the way that the player would obtain the weenie to ride it. Furthermore, there's also an older version of this enemy that couldn't be grabbed like basically every other enemy in the game, and would also leave behind a trail effect when moving around. Then next, although the shrimp thugs are seen in the Pig City level, there are actually 2 additional variants for them that go unused. And although titled green and blue respectively, their color palettes actually don't match their names. Anyways, the green version would try to get up close to Peppino and would throw trash objects at him, and the blue version would act similar to the darker knife-throwing shrimps that are seen in the game. And similarly, there's data left over for a variant of Kentucky Kenny called Kentucky Lenny, who, as was seen in older builds, would have had a slightly different color palette and, more importantly, would have thrown fireballs at you instead of just some hot chicken. Next, there's an enemy called a bear trap that fittingly is just a bear trap in a pizza box. It would clamp down on the player, and then this also unused red button would appear, basically instructing you to mash the jump button to escape it. And lastly, for the leftover unused enemies, we got an early version of Fake Peppino. So if you didn't know, before Fake Peppino was turned into a boss, the plan for him was to either show up after activating Pizza Time, or after picking up a key, similar to the Phanto enemies from Mario games. Then, after spawning in, he would have been impossible to defeat, and would chase Peppino around on the way back to the exit. The fake Peppino would have actually copied the player's movement, so no matter what you do, he would always be only a second or two behind you. I recently personally experienced some of this in an older playtester build where this early Peppino can be seen in a level titled Top that was scrapped, and honestly, it's pretty unnerving. Then, also related to fake Peppino, left over unused are his arms and legs, and these were apparently meant to have stuck out of walls and would attack the player too. Now those are the enemies that go unused, but there are also a few behaviors for some enemies that were scrapped for the final build too. And these are actually part of the scrapped heat meter mechanic that I went over in my first video, where in older pre-release builds, getting combos and filling up the meter would cause enemies to perform new unique moves, and yeah, I guess at least a few of these are still left over in the final game too. These include the pizza soldiers whipping out a pizza cutter, Pinacools doing a spin attack, and this one unfortunately isn't left over in the game, the cardboard tank dashing forward like we went over earlier, then similarly the fork knight would also use a jetpack to charge forward, and the pincer also had a similar lunge attack. Mini Johns would do some sort of air attack, the ninja slices would have had a rapid punch move that would fire out projectiles, the Swedish monkeys were to throw down some angry versions of the bananas, the cheese slimes would swing a bat, the flying anchovies would inflate themselves and drop down, the pickles would duplicate, the UF olives would have dropped the olive trooper enemies, the spit cheese enemies would have spat out a bigger projectile than normal, and lastly the noise goblins would have shot out an alternate arrow that would have homed in on the player. Now, I think alternate attacks like this would have been pretty cool, but I hear this is a pretty contentious topic, so I'm curious what you think about the removal of these. Then, similar to these, in my previous videos I also went over a different version of the heat meter titled the Style Bar, and after defeating enough enemies to reach the crazy state, certain enemies would get a unique color swap. The Pizzards would get a red outfit, and Pepperoni Goblins would become purple, which is a remnant from the old Halloween demo build of the game. Mini Johns would turn into a more pinkish color, Swedish monkeys would have lighter fur with red pants and a red helmet, and finally the Fork Knights would get some nice golden armor. So by now, it should be no surprise that the final version of Pizza Tower has a ton of leftovers from earlier pre-release builds, and we've only scratched the surface so far. Left over from the eggplant build of the game, we have the early placeholder eggplant heads-up display graphic, as well as the animation for completing a stage from when ranks were still being finalized. And there are also leftover rooms, including this old disclaimer mentioning the eggplant build's pre-release status, as well as this level select screen that was featured in it too. And interestingly, when loaded in, this level select screen, for the most part, is still very much functional, and you can use it to start up all of the levels that appear on the menu. Then, from probably the most well-received demo build, there are several leftovers from the Sage 2019 demo. This includes the manual that was present in the demo to teach the player about enemies, transformations, the deep Pizza Tower lore, and more. I honestly really like this manual and all the goofy artwork that it features. I really wish something like this had been made up for the final cut of the game. Next, there are a whole bunch of other unused leftover graphics from this build as well. To start, graphics for all of the Cowboy Task achievements seen in the demo are left over in both the locked and unlocked states. And not only are the sprites left over, but so is the text mentioning how to unlock them, including getting S ranks in every level, getting a combo of 10, and so forth. And furthermore, one of these can actually still be unlocked by tweaking some coding remaining from Snick's challenge, and then after getting an S rank on any level, you will get the achievement unlocking graphic to pop up. And to add to all of this, remnants of the Cowboy Task room showcasing all of the achievements is also left over in the game, but loading into it just causes the game to crash. Also left over are graphics for the Sage 2019 building, the signs for the Cowboy Task room, as well as for the tutorial stage. There's the very well-known sign pointing towards the scrapped playable character, Snick the Porcupine. Yes, it is him. And there's also graphics left over for the computers that were seen in the Sage build that served as the method of entering a given stage. One for Blood Sauce Dungeon, the Ancient Cheese, as well as Snick's Challenge, which is definitely not a reference to any sort of creepypasta of the EXE variety. There's also a similar computer for Pizzascape, but this one is a recolor from the Halloween demo and not the Sage 2019 one. Moreover, although Snick's Challenge was only seen in the Sage demo, much like the game's hard mode that we went over in my first video, remnants of it are actually still left over in the final game too, and can still be somewhat enabled. Next, another interesting thing that's left over unused from earlier builds is the text bubble that once appeared coming from the heads-up display TV. The TV was once planned to provide some commentary as you played through a level and obtained transformations and such, and would have also shared some bits of lore with the player. Apparently, since it was deemed that not many people would have taken the time to actually read the text while playing through a level, the concept was simplified to just teaching the player how to control Peppino in the beginning stages until ultimately the decision to just scrap the concept was made. But yeah, this is another thing that can be re-enabled in the game, and if you edit the code, you can also customize the text to say whatever you'd like it to, and you can also display whichever TV screen you want to. Next up, in my last video, we went over some unused songs left over in the game, but there are also a few sound effects that never ended up getting used. These include an old sound effect for loading Peppino's shotgun, and then there are several enemy screams. As a little fun fact, these were actually recorded by a few members of the Pizza Tower Discord server as part of a contest that was held there. These would only have a rare chance of playing when defeating an enemy, and there were apparently 10 screams that won the contest, but out of these 10, only 3 are left over in the final build. Oh yeah, also here's your volume warning, as 2 of these are, pretty loud. And now, last up for this video, I mentioned a few of them earlier, but let's go over the unused rooms or areas that are left over in Pizza Tower, of which there are actually a ton of. Now, we won't be going over all of them here because we'd probably be here all day, so I just want to focus on some of the ones I found most interesting. So first, let's start things off with a few cutscenes and title screens that are left over from earlier demo builds. First, we got old real title screen, and here you could either choose to erase your save file settings with the door on the right, bring up an options menu with the counter at the middle, or start the game with the phone by the bathroom on the left, which would bring up an old character select screen that would have let you choose between starting as Peppino or the Noise, as we went over in my previous videos. Now, what's extra interesting here is that there's also leftover functionality from an old Christmas demo of the game that can be re-enabled, which will result in Santa Claus swooping in and picking up Peppino. Then next, there's just title screen, which is where the Santa was meant to have been seen, and again, this is a leftover hub entrance of sorts from the Christmas demo. Then there's real title screen, which was an update to the previous one, where this time the phone on the left would bring up the options menu, this door would have brought up the level select menu, and then these 3 doors would have represented 3 different save files. And then, similar to Super Mario Land 2, by picking up this bomb here and trying to enter a door, you could delete the save data for that particular file. Then moving on to the unused cutscene areas, first we got Scooter Transition, which was a precursor to the player spawning into the title screen area we went over earlier, where we can see Peppino clinging onto Santa's sack for dear life. And then there's Level Transition Cutscene, and unfortunately almost everything from this area is removed by this point, but this was the cutscene that would play during a level when progressing to a higher floor, where Peppino could have been seen climbing up some stairs. Now next up, there are a whopping total of 27 unused secret rooms left over in the game. Apparently, originally there were plans to have 6 secret rooms per stage until this was eventually rolled back to just 3 instead. And as such, quite a few of the 3 scrap secret rooms are left over from 9 levels, including Oregano Desert, Pig City, the Ice level with the long name, Blood Sauce Dungeon, Deep Dish 9, and more. Anyways, yeah, I think it's good that the choice of quality over quantity was made. Then moving on, next there are 3 different early iterations of the Hub Overworld area left over in the game. The earliest of these, listed as Hub Room 1, is a hub area dating back to 2020 and is a single area with doors to each of the levels from the first world, and in some builds would also have smaller doors that would lead to other levels too. Now, apparently, Mr. Stick can also be found here at the top, charging 25,000 points to unlock the next area. Now, despite being the earliest hub area, this one is the most complete, at least visually here. There's also a second room from this first iteration that's much less complete, and as we'll see with many of the leftover rooms going forward, the graphics aren't exactly, well, there. So we have to enable visualizing collision in order to see where we're going. Anyways, this is a very early area for the second world that basically just has entrance doors as well as another Mr. Stick unlockable area at the end. Then next up, we move on to the second iteration of the hub world that's much more expansive. And this is actually a remnant of the hub world that was seen in the September 2021 build, and let me tell ya, bigger isn't always better. I, again, recently played some of that build, and this version of the hub area is quite confusing. but it was kinda cool how beating each level would cause something to happen in the hub area that would allow you to proceed to the next level. Anyways, in the interest of time, we won't be going through the entire hub area, but if you're interested, check out my recent VOD on the playtester build, which will be linked in the description. Anyways, it was pretty cool to see the remnants of this build, including the boxing ring where the boss fights would have occurred. Then there are only 3 unused rooms that are a remnant of a third iteration of the hub area that was worked on quite late in developing the game, from a time where, although much of the hub area was how it is seen today, the game's developer McPig attempted to revise the hub area one last time. He then came to the conclusion that only World 1's hub wasn't up to par, so eventually this third iteration was scrapped and just the first world was redone. Anyways, these are pretty small areas, so they aren't as interesting, but these actually do have the proper entrance doors for the stages this time around. But wait, there's more, as there's actually a total of 16 unused levels, many of which are early versions of those seen in the game. Now, for the most part, these are pretty broken and not exactly visually pleasing, and just like the hub area, if you're interested in seeing how these areas look and play as how they were more intended to, I'll kindly direct you to my recent playthrough of the demo build. That said, there are a few interesting areas among these of particular note. First, there's an unused stage known only as Exit, and as the name implies, this appears to be an old version of exiting the tower, similar to Crumbling Tower of Pizza. And just like that stage, this one is basically a gauntlet that features most enemies and mechanics that are seen in the game, like various otherwise unused stuff that we went over earlier, including some unused blocks, some that don't function properly, and some that do. Honestly, although parts of it are impossible to get through without using no-clip to phase through walls, it was pretty cool to play through. Then there are also early versions of the factory, sewer, and freezer levels, a very early version of the golf stage that's a leftover from an old April Fool's build when the golf mechanic was a joke before it actually ended up getting reworked into an actual level. There's 2 versions of a scrapped stage known as Mansion that was relegated to just being a secret room in the hub area, a scrapped level known as Space Pinball that was seemingly mostly repurposed into Fast Food Saloon, and then there's yet another level that was intended to be a final level known as Top. This was, again, a challenge gauntlet that would feature a whole bunch of enemies and mechanics that are seen throughout the game. And I hope you're not tired of me bringing up levels that acted as a gauntlet featuring many aspects seen in the game, as there's yet another one that was a scrapped stage known as Dragon Lair. Now, unlike the other ones, this wasn't meant to be a final level, but rather it was meant to be the boss stage for World 1. The stage would start with the player pressing 5 buttons to spawn in 5 Toppin warriors, who are scrapped Power Ranger-inspired versions of the Toppins. These would then follow Peppino around as you go through the level, and unfortunately though, due to how the weenie rideable was changed, it isn't normally beatable as you can't cross these strips of pizza sauce without it. But if we fly around with no clip enabled, we can get through it and see what the rest of the area entails, including featuring the large scrapped cheese dragon boss that's seen in the old tower secret in the game, and these fellas would block your path to get to the next room. And yeah, after completing the stage, you would have obtained a large key, and this would have let you move on to the next world. And now, lastly for this video, there's one more unused boss area that I want to go over, and it's known simply as Boss B. Loading into this area reveals a small room with an even smaller bee that chases you around. Yeah, this little fella was actually once considered for being a boss in Pizza Tower. Anyways, if the bee touches Peppino, you will lose control of him for a few seconds as he runs around to get away from the bee. The main idea of this fight at this stage is that by pressing this red button here on the side, a puff of green smoke will be released and then blown downwards by this fan, and the goal was to try and hit the bee with this green gas. By doing so here, the bee gets stunned and will shake around for a bit. Now, unfortunately, you can't defeat the bee or anything here, so there's not really too much to this room, and apparently the decision to axe this fight was made since it was deemed to be more so a stage gimmick than a proper boss fight, at least compared to the others in the game. Now, I don't know about you, but I think the idea of a large Italian pizza man fighting a tiny little bee would have been great, but yeah, it would have had to have featured better gameplay than this. Anyways, we'll leave it there for this video, and I hope you enjoyed it. I think I got about one more Pizza Tower video left in me before I'm Peppino'd out, where I want to briefly go over all of the pre-release builds leading up to the final release of the game, so stay tuned for that. While you're here, check out some of my other Lost Bits videos, and be sure to subscribe to find your way back here in the future. And as always, thank you all so much for watching today, and I will see you in a bit.